our friends, you know, they looked at us and they said, oh, Josh and Roz, you know, they've got a good marriage. I mean, they're good together, you know. But little did they know, and little did we know.
Divorce is an all too common reality of married life today. But what are the alternatives if partners are always in conflict or when a marriage has been shattered by infidelity? Coming up, we'll meet some couples who have overcome these problems as we look at healing hurting marriages.
Specific issues, but
John and Patricia Bartolo counsel many couples experiencing conflicts and unhappiness in their marriages.
Generally speaking, the woman's complaint tends to be that her husband does not listen to her, does not understand her, and to her this equates to his not loving her. And so there's a lot of hurt and anger on their part. The man oftentimes feels very misunderstood, feels that he does try to show his love, but that for some reason his wife is always very angry with him and upset with him, and he oftentimes feels that he just doesn't understand what the real problems are.
Oftentimes, if there's conflict, it's because the partners haven't truly listened to one another. One's jumping in and interrupting or being defensive or sarcastic, and that's when anger escalates, and that can lead to further problems.
Unfortunately, one of the things that gets in the way the most of people really being happy in a marriage and a relationship is the fear of getting hurt itself, and unfortunately that oftentimes leads to rejecting the relationship or pulling back or doing things that are hurtful to your partner in a way that can tend to destroy the relationship and then become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Armando and Margaret Martinez have been married 36 years, but like many couples, they've gone through some very difficult times. For the first 30 years, their lack of communication and drifting away from each other seemed to be leading them toward divorce.
For me, it was about that 7th year. Maybe there is something to the 7-year itch. I just began to notice that our family life was not as close due to his working, and he wasn't able to spend the time with us that I had dreamt of. We hardly ever had dinner together as a family. And I never knew what time he would come home. But while all this was happening, we weren't working at the marriage because we weren't together. So we were not learning how to communicate. And I would try to I push things down, not wanting to make trouble. And that was very bad. So I was very much part of the problem in not knowing how to communicate with Armando.
To me, marriage was being a loving husband, having a beautiful family, and providing for my children. And I did all those things. So it was a little bit difficult for me to accept the fact that Margie could be unhappy with our marriage when I was doing all the right things.
I tried to let him know what was going on with me, but I really didn't do it in a very good way. I tried to manipulate him by crying, by being moody, trying to get his attention. I really didn't know how to communicate, honestly, about my feelings. And my feelings were that I really felt abandoned. I felt betrayed. This pattern continued to our 30th year. And I kept going because of the children. I didn't want a divorce. I didn't want them to lose their father.
But it was frustrating because, as Margie mentioned, it was not a loving relationship that we had. I dreaded coming home.
I finally decided I had to get off this merry-go-round and just not work at my marriage. And that was my decision. I wasn't going to work at it anymore. And he seemed to accept that because he didn't fight that. And so we continued to live in this home as strangers for 3 years. I built a life for myself, and he always had his work, so he threw himself into that. But it was a terrible, terrible way to live because we weren't loving. There was no one to love. At the end of those 3 years, I was about ready to ask him for a formal separation, formal divorce.
Margaret and Armando had tried all kinds of marital counseling over the years with poor results. So they were skeptical when they heard about a Christian peer ministry for troubled marriages called Retrouvaille. Retrouvaille consists of 1 weekend and 12 follow-up presentations where couples learn how to communicate, forgive, and rediscover each other in a new positive way.
What comes from talking about your feelings. I had always suppressed mine, you see. I had always suppressed them, and he wouldn't deal with them. So in bringing our feelings out, we came to understand each other. We came to really meet each other on a whole new level that was totally missing.
It was hard for me to open up also and share my feelings. I had never done that in my life because of my background. You know, Latinos are supposed to be machos, and it was very difficult for me to speak and to communicate with Margie at that level. My father used to react the same way that I reacted towards Margie. But through our communication of our feelings, when I found out that I was acting just like my father, and I remember vividly being a little kid and just watching my dad react towards my mom, and I was doing the same thing. I hated that as a child, and later on as a young teenager. And I was doing the same thing. I learned my lesson well.
You have to keep working at it, but we know how to do it now, and that's where the hope lies. We know how to communicate. We know how to accept.
At the lowest point in our relationship, I didn't lose my faith, and neither did Margie. And I think that was the thing that saved our marriage. Because down deep we knew that God didn't want us to be divorced. God wanted us as a couple.
We were never together. We didn't pray together. And now it's just like we pray together all the time, and we really know that we're convinced that God is with our marriage.
Through the hope and the prayers, we were able to get back our marriage, which I believe it was a miracle.
Can a marriage survive adultery? Al Stott is a pastoral counselor with the New Life Center at First United Methodist Church in San Diego.
Can it be overcome? Well, that's a question that people often ask. Can I overcome this? Is there a way that we can get back to where we were? I don't think the relationship can ever be restored to what it was before, and maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe there were factors in that relationship prior to the adultery, if we want to call it adultery, that were eroding the love and the trust to begin with. I believe any relationship has the potential to be salvaged. And I have seen couples who have survived this after going through a great deal of self-searching and reevaluation of the relationship and finding for themselves dimensions of their relationship upon which they can rebuild the basis of the relationship.
Josh and Roz Howell have been married 34 years. They each grew up with certain expectations of marriage, but early on they weren't very good at communicating with each other.
Well, I know that I had some expectations for marriage, and I expected that we would live happily ever after. I really did believe in that fairy tale.
My expectations about marriage were kind of like all built around what I saw on TV, you know, like growing up in the 50s and the 60s. And I tell this story all the time that one of my favorite television shows at the time was Father Knows Best. The problem was that we really never sat down and talked to each other about those expectations to that extent.
After 4 children and with ever-demanding careers, Josh and Roz found they communicated even less and began to be isolated from one another.
I tore myself into my work. You know, my work became, you know, a #1 priority.
Finally, in their 19th year of marriage, when Roz became pregnant with her 5th child in spite of a previous tubal ligation, Josh was at the breaking point. At the time, his career was in jeopardy, and he demanded that Roz abort the child.
I could not abide an abortion that goes against everything I believe in. And I knew that I was also putting my marriage on the line. Woman's intuition, whatever you want to call it.
I believed at that point that the marriage was over, you know, emotionally. Maybe I was looking for someone to understand, you know, my side, what I was going through, you know, that I wasn't getting, you know, Roz, at that point in my life, you know, Roz she didn't understand, you know, how I felt, and we didn't know how to, between the two of us, express feelings. There was absolutely no communication. So a group of people used to get together at work, you know, after work, and, you know, I think I told, you know, someone what was happening, and you know, I think this woman commiserated and said, oh yeah, you know, I understand how you feel. So that's kind of like, you know, how it got started. And so just one thing kind of like just led to another, and I said, well, my marriage is down the tubes anyway, so, you know, what the hell, you know, kind of thing.
Eventually, Roz found out about the affair and confronted Josh. It seemed the marriage was finished, but Roz made one more attempt to contact her husband.
I called him in the hotel room, not knowing if he was going to be there or not. And a sleepy voice answered. I'll let you continue.
And she was just calling to find out how I was doing. How are you? Are you okay? And that's when I said to myself, what are you doing? You know, that it kind of like it just hit me. I decided that pursuing another relationship wasn't what I really wanted, that I had already invested 20 years in this one. 5 other lives, you know, were at stake here. What in God's name was I doing? We asked the question, was this marriage, was this relationship worth saving? And fortunately, we came to the conclusion that it was. So we kind of like sat down and, you know, I told her, you know, the whole story. But then that's when the hell really began.
I really did not experience that he was penitent. You know, the words were coming out of his mouth, but his body language and just his whole demeanor kind of was saying, well, yeah, I did it, so what? And that was not what I wanted to hear at the time. Why couldn't we just sit and talk? Why couldn't he just listen to what I had to say? Why was it that I had to defend what I was feeling and really couldn't defend it? All I know is that I was hurting, and I somehow wanted him to make it better.
And all I was saying was, you know, I admitted my mistake, you know, like Clinton, you know, forgive and forget. But later on, we found out that, you know, that's a myth, that you can't, you know, just forgive and forget, you know, like that. So, and then that's when we really began to battle each other, you know, and she was asking me, you know, questions, you know, the details and all that. I said, well, I don't remember, like, you know, same thing. I don't remember, or I don't want to remember, you know, it's over. Why do you need to know all that stuff? And then that's when we went to counseling. And that opened the door, you know, for us to kind of like look at who we were as individuals, where we had come from, why we were behaving the way we did, and what we needed to do to get back on track.
To turn the whole thing around.
To get back on track emotionally.
One of the primary things that counseling did was to allow us to be who we were. I'd say prior to that we were actors in a role. We had been cast in this particular role, and we thought we had to play the part. But the counseling said, no, you don't have to do that anymore. You can be who you are. And that was tremendously freeing.
For the Howells, forgiveness finally became real at a spiritual retreat. In a moment rich with symbolism, the participants washed each other's feet as Christ washed the feet of his disciples.
In the midst of all of that, Josh came to me and he asked me, I want you to forgive me. Will you allow me to wash your feet? That's what did it. I experienced, it wasn't groveling, but I experienced that for the first time, he experienced my pain and was willing to help me to forget that.
I think it's a mistake to look at our Christian heritage as forgiving just means pushing down the hurt or the anger and not dealing with it, because that really isn't forgiving. That's just stuffing things. The lessons of Christianity are very important in your marriage, and first amongst those is being able to forgive and not just bury the anger or the difference, but come to a point of really being able to let it go.
We appeared to be the all-American successful couple. And where did you see God portrayed in any of that, you know?
During the 19 years of our marriage, I forgot about God. I forgot how important it was to be related to God, and kind of thought that I could do everything on my own. When we decided to go back to the church and all the principles that we had been raised with, it was tremendously uplifting to experience God working in my life again, to acknowledge God working in my life again.
We're trying to follow His plan now, and not as much, you know, the world's plan as we did before.
When I work with couples, I always start by asking them what their expectations originally were when they got married. What I find time and time again is that there's a problem operating that I call the romantic myth. And that is that love is this mystical, magical thing, a union of two people who are soulmates, and it's supposed to be something that just happens, that you don't really have to work at it if it's real love. You're supposed to, you know, real love will conquer all, that type of thing. And they're basing their idea on what that first 6 months to a year with all the chemistry and so on is in their relationship. And then when that begins to settle down into a more normal pattern, to them, they feel sort of cheated, that I don't wake up every morning and just, you know, totally desire to look in your face and so on. It must not have ever been real love. We must not have been really soulmates and matched for each other, which unfortunately leads to an attitude of change partners. Now, a different way of looking at this that we try to promote both in our work premaritally and with couples that are troubled is one of, in a sense, no pain, no gain. If you don't put some work and effort into learning how to communicate and bonding closer, then you really shouldn't expect the rewards of the closeness and so on. I think in every other area of life, we tend to look at it that way. We don't look at it as it's just supposed to happen and you're not supposed to have to work hard at it to be a success, or sports or any kind of thing that we would do. But in love and marriage, we just think it should happen. And that's partly because we're not really taught much about how marriages work and how to make them better and have the skills that really fulfill you long term in your marriage. And that's a message I want people to understand, is that, you know, we feel so many things out of our control these days. And if you really work at it and you're willing to learn the skills that it takes to make a marriage work, you can be in control of the destiny of your relationship. You can guarantee that it will be good.
For the long haul, I think people need to develop a sense of a different dimension of love, a different kind of love which is sustaining, and that's kind of a self-sacrificing love, which we in the Christian tradition call agape. The love which gives to the other person without expecting anything in return. And that's the kind of love which also is supported by forgiveness, which is supported by compassion and real genuine care for the other person.
We are 15 years after the fact, and I think that says a lot to people. It doesn't have to end that way. If you're willing to work at it, and we have to work at it, we're still working at it.
If your marriage is facing difficulties, don't give up hope. God cares about your marriage and wants you to put it into His hands. If you and your partner share a high level of commitment to each other and you ask God to help, there is a good chance you can come through the tough times with an even stronger marriage.